The first time Sergeant Dara Okafor died on Verdun Beach, she didn't even know the alien's name. Nobody did back then. The Keth didn't introduce themselves. They came down in the meteorite swarms of 2031, burrowing into the rock of the European continent, like something that had been waiting inside the planet all along, and then they started killing. 5 years later, humanity had a word for them, Keth, and very little else. They didn't respond to signals. They didn't take prisoners. They didn't pause between offensives to let their enemy catch a breath. By 2036, France was gone. By 2037, Germany. The push east was slowing, but it wasn't stopping. And the high-altitude surveillance drones that survived long enough to transmit data back showed the same picture every time. The continent as a single writhing organism, a billion moving parts that answered to something deeper underground that humanity hadn't yet located, hadn't yet named, hadn't yet understood. Dara Okafor was a signals analyst when the war began. She sat in a basement, in Cheltenham, intercepting Keth transmission frequencies. Not that they transmitted anything intelligible, but the patterns of their coordination signals told you things. She was good at patterns. She had a gift for sitting with noise until the signal surfaced, for staying calm when everyone around her was cycling through the stages of institutional panic. When the coalition announced Operation Anvil, the amphibious assault on the French coast that command was calling humanity's last realistic opportunity to push the Keth back before they hit the Atlantic. Her commanding officer put her name on the forward deployment list. She had protested exactly once. I read signals, she'd said. I don't carry a gun. You will now, her CO had said, and that was the end of that. She'd trained for 8 weeks in the exosuit they gave her, a Mark IV combat frame that weighed 87 pounds and could stop a Keth puncture spike at close range if you angled your shoulder correctly. She learned to angle her shoulder correctly. She learned to run in the thing, to roll, to fire the rail attachment one-handed while the suit's gyros compensated for recoil. She was not a natural soldier. She was a woman who learned quickly and slept badly and spent most of her free time in the weeks before the invasion sitting on the edge of her cot with her headphones in, listening to recordings of Keth signal patterns and trying to feel the shape of what moved beneath them. The morning of the invasion, she was on the landing craft with 43 other soldiers, most of them strangers, the channel gray and the sky the color of old pewter. Nobody was talking. A private named Hollis was sick over the side. A staff sergeant named Vance was doing something with a set of prayer beads that Dara couldn't quite see. The man beside her, a broad-shouldered infantry corporal named Race, who had the kind of stillness that either meant exceptional calm or complete dissociation, was staring at the horizon with his jaw set and his hands folded in his lap. First time, Dara asked him, he looked at her. 7th push, he said. 7th time we've tried to take this beach. She hadn't known that. Nobody had told her that. What happened the other 6 times, she asked. He looked back at the horizon. This, he said. She found out what he meant 40 seconds after the ramp dropped. The Keth were waiting. They were always waiting. That was the thing nobody had found an answer to. The intelligence failure that command kept calling an anomaly, and the people actually doing the dying called something simpler. The Keth knew. They knew every time. The moment the landing craft hit the surf, they came up from the sand in their hundreds, their exo-limbs folding outward from the ground like something hatching, their bodies low and fast, and organized in ways that no biological organism should be organized. The beach became a white noise of rail fire and Keth screech and the wet percussion of puncture spikes hitting exosuit plating. Dara ran because running was the only option available. She saw Hollis go down on her left. She saw Vance take a spike through the throat, the prayer beads scattering across the sand. She ran and she fired and she did not stop moving, and it didn't matter because the Keth were everywhere, coordinated in real time, and the pattern of their movement was. She saw it. In the middle of all of it, in the blood and the noise and the dying, she saw the pattern. The Keth weren't attacking randomly. They were funneling. The ones on the flanks were slower, deliberately slower, creating a channel that pushed the surviving soldiers toward a killing ground near the seawall. It was a trap built from the movement of 1,000 bodies, and it was elegant, and she was already inside it, and then a Keth hit her from behind, and the spike went through the gap between her shoulder plate and her helmet, and she felt a brightness behind her eyes that she had no language for, and she died. She woke up on the landing craft. The channel was gray. The sky was pewter. Hollis was sick over the side. Vance was working his prayer beads. Reese sat beside her with his jaw set and his hands folded, and she knew with a certainty She could not yet explain that she had been here before. She said nothing. She waited. The ramp dropped. She ran onto the beach and it happened exactly as it had happened before. Every Keth in the same position, every spike arriving at the same angle. The same funneling pattern driving survivors toward the same seawall, and she died again in nearly the same moment, and woke up again on the landing craft. The third time she tried to break left off the ramp, away from the funnel. A Keth was waiting there that hadn't been visible in the previous loops, and she died faster than either time before. She woke up on the landing craft and sat very still with her hands in her lap and tried to breathe evenly, and thought about what she had, and what she didn't have, and what she might be able to build from the space between those two things. What she had, a loop. Death reset it. She didn't know the mechanism. She didn't know the limit. She knew only that it worked. That she retained memory across iterations while apparently no one around her did, and that she had woken up 8 times now. She'd lost count of the exact number. In the same moment with the same gray light, and the same smell of engine oil and cold salt water, and the same 43 people who were all about to die. What she didn't have, enough information. She was a signals analyst. She could read patterns. But she needed data, and data required iterations, and iterations meant dying on that beach over and over, while she built a picture of something she might eventually be able to use. She told Rice on the 4th iteration, partly because she needed someone to talk to, and partly because he'd been to this beach 7 times before she ever arrived, and she wanted to know if that meant anything. He listened to her without interrupting, which she hadn't expected. When she finished, he looked at the horizon for a moment and then said, "I had a friend who said something like that once. In the second push, he said he'd done it before. We thought he'd cracked. Had he? He was the only one of us who made it past the seawall that day." He paused. "He didn't make it back from the seawall, but that's something different. So you believe me?" "I believe you've seen the beach before," he said carefully. "I believe you're not crazy, or not the kind of crazy that gets people killed uselessly. Beyond that," he shrugged inside the exosuit, the servos clicking softly. "Beyond that, I'd like to see you prove it." She proved it by telling him exactly how he would die in the next 12 minutes if they followed standard deployment protocol. She described his death in enough detail. The angle of the spike, the side of the neck, the direction he'd be facing when it hit. That when the ramp dropped, he turned to look at her with something new in his eyes. And she said, "Stay close," and he did. He made it past the seawall that day. So did Dara for the first time. Past the seawall was a bombed-out resort town that the Keth had converted into something between a way station and a nest. The architecture of it was wrong in ways that took a moment to process. Keth structures were grown rather than built, extruded from a biological material that hardened into geometric forms, honeycombing through the existing ruins until the original buildings were just scaffolding for something else. The signal patterns Dara had been listening to for 2 years were everywhere here, audible now as a low subsonic pulse she could feel in the fillings of her back teeth. She stopped in the shadow of what had been a hotel facade and closed her eyes and listened. The pattern had changed. At the beach, the Keth coordination signal was dense and multi-directional. Every unit talking to every other unit, real-time tactical adjustment. Here, inside the town, there was something else beneath it. A slower pulse, rhythmic, not tactical. Something more fundamental, like a heartbeat beneath a conversation. "There's something deeper," she told Rice. "Something the tactical units are answering to. Not just answering to, reporting to, like." She searched for the right word. "Like they're not thinking, they're being thought for. The way a nerve is thought for by a brain." "Where is it?" "I don't know yet." She died 2 minutes later when a Keth rounded a corner she hadn't anticipated. She woke on the landing craft. Hollis was sick over the side. She went back. She went back 41 more times over the following subjective weeks, though none of that time existed anywhere except in her memory. She died on the beach. She died in the surf. She died in the hotel ruins. She died pushing down a stairwell into a Keth sublevel that turned out to be occupied by more Keth than she could count. She died from spikes and from the crushing impact of Keth exolimbs, and once, memorably, from drowning in the flooded basement of a spa that had been converted into a Keth nutrient pool. She died and she came back, and each time she came back she knew a little more. She kept notes in the only place she had available to keep them. In her memory, organized with the same methodical patience she'd always applied to signal analysis. She built a map of the town. She built a map of the Keth patrol patterns. She built, slowly and painfully, a map of the signal architecture. tracing the deeper pulse from its surface expressions back toward whatever was generating it. On the 43rd iteration, she told Rice what she'd found. "There's a central node," she said. The landing craft was cold, and he was looking at her the way he always looked at her, before she'd explained herself, skeptically, but with the specific quality of skepticism that's actually attention. Under the old train station. The tactical units on the beach, in the town, in a radius that I estimate is about 30 kilometers. They're all coordinated through it. Not through each other. Through this thing. You think if we destroy it. I think if we destroy it, the tactical coordination collapses. The units don't stop existing. They stop being organized, she paused. Disorganized Keth are still dangerous, but they're manageable. The beach is not manageable. The beach is what it is because something is telling every Keth on it exactly where to be. Rice was quiet for a moment. How do we get to the train station? I know a route. I've died on every other route. This one I've only died on twice, and both times it was from mistakes I won't make again. You've been practicing. I've been practicing, she agreed. She'd practiced for 6 more iterations after that. Running the route with Rice, timing it, working out where to stop and where to move fast, and where to go to ground while a Keth patrol passed. Calibrating the pauses to half-second precision. She'd also practiced something else. In the 9th iteration, she'd gone back to the boat and not said anything to anyone, and died on the beach and woken up, and then stayed on the boat and said nothing to anyone for the entire crossing, and let the ramp drop, and stood at the back of the formation, and watched and catalogued the precise moment when each of the 43 other soldiers died, and what they had done in the seconds immediately before, and whether any of those moments could have been different. 14 of them could have been different, she judged. 14 deaths that were the result of an angle taken or a decision made that she could see, now were wrong. Not because those soldiers were bad at their jobs, but because they couldn't see what she could see, didn't have the iterations she had. She carried those 14 people in her memory. She carried the weight of their deaths like coordinates on a map. She planned for them. On the 49th iteration, she talked to all of them. Not just Resus, 43, in the 40 minutes before the ramp dropped. She moved through the landing craft and she said specific things to specific people. The angle of approach to take off the ramp. The moment to go to ground before the spike that would otherwise hit them. The route to the seawall and the gap in the Keth line at the east end that opened for exactly 11 seconds every 4 minutes. She said it quickly and without a lot of explanation because there wasn't time for a lot of explanation, and because she'd learned, over the iterations, that most people didn't need the full theory of why she knew what she knew. They needed to know that she knew it, and that following the instruction was more likely to keep them alive than ignoring it. She had, by this point, a certain quality in her voice that she'd developed through repetition, calm and very specific. The voice of someone who has already seen what happens when you don't listen. Most of them listened. The ramp dropped. Dara ran onto the beach and it was still terrifying. It would always be terrifying. She'd accepted that. But she moved through the terror with the precision of someone who has drawn the same line so many times the pencil finds the groove by itself. She hit the seawall with 29 of her 43 soldiers still living. That was the most she'd ever brought across the beach. She held there for 4 seconds while Rice counted off the Keth patrol cycle. And then she led them into the town. The hotel was different with 29 people behind her. It was also different because she'd died enough times in it to have memorized the exact location of every Keth unit they'd encounter. She moved through the ruins like a woman, walking through her own house in the dark. Hand out for the door frame she knew was coming. Foot finding the step without looking. Behind her, the soldiers followed in a silence that had a specific quality to it. The silence of people who have seen enough to understand that the woman leading them knows something they don't, and have made the pragmatic decision to trust it. The subsonic pulse was stronger as they moved deeper into the town, and Dara felt it the way she always felt it here, in her back teeth and in the base of her sternum. She stopped twice to recalibrate, listening for the higher tactical signals that would tell her whether a unit had deviated from its expected patrol path. Once a deviation happened, a Keth scout that was 20 meters off its projected route, and she held up a fist and everyone stopped, and the scout passed 7 meters from them and didn't register their presence and moved on. Rice let out a breath beside her. The private behind him, a young woman named Bako, who'd been in signals before the draft, caught Dara's eye and gave a small, precise nod that said, "I know what you just did, and I understand it." Dara filed that away. The train station had been beautiful once. She knew that from photographs she'd looked at in the earlier iterations. The old stone facade with its arched windows, the Art Deco lettering above the main entrance. Now the stone was threaded through, with Keth extrusion in a complex pattern that had the fractal quality she associated with high-complexity Keth signal architecture. The more processing something did, the more elaborate the material expression of it became. The building was dense with it. It pulsed at a frequency she could feel from 100 meters out. She stopped the group at the edge of the plaza. "The node is 2 levels down," she said quietly. "There's a central chamber. The Keth have converted the old underground platform into something that functions like a relay. The units on the beach, everything within range, it all runs through that room." She looked at them. 29 faces in exosuits. Tired and scared and sharp, with the particular focus that comes from having survived something that should have killed you. "We go in through the North Service entrance. I'll take point. There are 4 Keth units inside the station before we hit the stairs. I know where they are." "How?" Baco said. "I've been here before," Dara said. "More times than I can count." She paused. "You'll have to take my word for it." Nobody argued. They'd seen too much of the beach to argue. The North Service entrance was a metal door that the Keth had partially sealed with extruded material. Dara had solved this problem in a previous iteration. The sealing was incomplete at the lower left corner, and the material was brittle enough that a single focused blow from an exosuit gauntlet cracked it cleanly. She cracked it. They went through. The 4 Keth inside the station died quickly. She'd rehearsed this enough times to have it choreographed. Not in a way she could have fully explained to anyone. Just in the sense that her body knew where to be when, and her squad had been positioned correctly to make it work. It lasted 11 seconds. Then they were moving down the stairs. The platform was vast and lit by something bioluminescent that the Keth had grown across the ceiling, a blue-green light that made everyone's faces look underwater. The node itself occupied the center of the space where the tracks had been, an organic mass roughly 3 meters across and 2 meters tall, the Keth growth material layered in spiraling formations around a core that pulsed visibly with each signal beat. Dara could feel it in her chest now, regular as a second heartbeat. Around the node, 12 Keth units stood in a ring, motionless, oriented inward, guards. She'd died on these 12 guards 4 times in earlier iterations, before she'd found the approach angle that made 3 of them turn away at the right moment. "Wait," she said. Counted. "Now move left now, stay low." 3 of the ring guards rotated. A gap opened. She moved into it with Rice and Baco immediately behind her, and the rest of the squad spreading into the positions she'd talked them into on the boat. And then it was loud and fast and very close. And she didn't have time to think anymore, only to move and to trust what the iterations had built into her body. The accumulated knowledge of 49 attempts compressed into something that felt almost like instinct. The guards went down. 7 of her people went down with them, and she had no time to mourn that, but she was counting, and she was tracking, and the node was 3 meters away, and the device Rice was carrying. A breaching charge, stripped from a dead engineer's kit in the 16th iteration and carried faithfully across every beach, was in his hand. She reached the node. She put her hand on the outer surface and the signal hit her like a wave. All of it at once, the entire tactical architecture of the Keth force flowing through her palm, and for just a moment she could feel the shape of it. The beach, the town, the units in the ruins and in the surf and in the sand, all of them oriented and purposeful and connected to this single point, this one thing. She stepped back. "Now," she said. Rice placed the charge. They moved fast, up the stairs, the squad around her, the ones who were left, and they made the service entrance and kept moving across the plaza. And they were 40 meters out when the charge went, and the ground shook and the bioluminescent light from the station windows went out. Silence below. Not silence above. The rails above ground still crackled with weapons fire, the sounds of the broader battle unchanged. But from the coordinated Keth assault that had been running since the moment the landing craft hit the surf, something had shifted. The signals she was reading, the tactical pulse she'd been tracking for subjective weeks. They stuttered, fragmented, and dissolved into what she recognized immediately as decentralized noise. No coordination. Individual Keth, acting on individual impulse without the collective intelligence directing them. They were still dangerous. 3 of her remaining soldiers were wounded in the next 20 minutes moving back toward the beach. But it was manageable. It was the kind of fight that humans had been fighting for 100,000 years. Chaotic and terrible and winnable. She stopped on the beach, in the same surf where she had died and died again, and she let herself stop for just a moment and breathe. The gray sky was the same sky, the channel was the same channel, but the beach was empty of the organized ambush that had been waiting for every previous wave, and the soldiers coming off the landing craft behind the second wave were spreading across it intact, not funneled into a killing ground, not dying in the first 40 seconds. She watched them come and she counted them, and she thought about all the times she had crossed this sand and left everyone on it. Rice appeared at her shoulder. He was bleeding from a cut below his left eye that the suit's medical system had sealed, and he had the expression of a man who had been to this beach 8 times and was still standing, which was an expression that required a certain specific language to read correctly. She had that language now. How many times, he said. 49, she said. Give or take. He was quiet for a moment. How long did it feel like? She thought about that. The iterations had blurred at the edges. The earlier ones compressed by repetition into something like a single smeared memory. The later ones distinct and specific and detailed. The farmhouse she'd sheltered in during the 22nd iteration, where she'd first figured out the signal architecture. The conversation she'd had with Baco in the 31st iteration, before Baco had known who she was, and Baco's particular way of saying, I understand. The way the dying gun looked from the back of the formation, quiet and too fast and mostly confused, the way dying usually was. She had carried 50 people's deaths in her memory for what felt like months, and she did not know what that was going to mean for her. Later, when there was a later. Long enough, she said, and you remember all of it, all of it. He nodded slowly. Then you're carrying a lot of people who don't know you saved them. She hadn't thought of it that way. She thought of it that way now, standing in the surf with the sounds of a battle that was no longer the coordinated massacre it had been, and she thought about Hollis, who had been sick over the side of the boat and was now alive somewhere on this beach, and Vance, who had kept his prayer beads, and the 14 who she'd watched die and then saved, and the ones she hadn't been able to save, and all of it sitting in her memory like a city that only she could enter. Yes, she said. Behind them, a signals officer from the second wave was running up the beach with a radio, calling for the senior analyst, calling for whoever had knocked out the coordination node, calling for the person responsible. Baco, who had made it off the beach intact and had survived the station and was bleeding from her right arm, and wearing the expression of someone who had been through something she was going to be thinking about for a very long time, was pointing at Dara. Dara turned to face the approaching officer. She felt very tired and very clear, the way you feel at the end of a long task that required everything you had, when the task is done and the receipts of everything it cost are still coming in. The signals officer was a young man, maybe 25, out of breath and wide-eyed in the particular way of someone who has watched a disorganized enemy where they expected a coordinated massacre. Are you Okafor? He said. Surgeon Okafor, they're saying you knew where the node was. They're saying you knew the patrol patterns, the exact timings. How? He stopped, caught his breath. How did you know? She thought about how to answer that. She thought about the 49 crossings, the 49 deaths, the months of subjective time she'd spent building a map of a beach and a town, and a signal architecture that had killed every wave that had tried this before. She thought about the shape of the loop, the specific quality of waking on the landing craft, for the 49th, knowing what was coming, and knowing you would do it anyway. She thought about what that did to a person, and whether there was a version of that story she could put into a sentence. Pattern recognition, she said. I'm good at patterns. He stared at her. She could see him deciding that this was insufficient, and also that there was something in her face that told him pursuing it would not lead where he wanted to go. Not today. The command team wants a full debrief, he said. Everything you know about the node architecture. If there are more of them. There are more of them, Dara said. There are many more of them. She had known this since the 28th iteration, when she'd mapped enough of the signal architecture to see that the node under the train station was not unique. It was a relay point in a larger network, one of many such points distributed across the occupied territory, all of them answering to something further in, something she'd only been able to sense at the outer edge of her instruments, something central, something that would require much more than one beach and one town to reach. She thought about what it was going to take. She thought about the fact that she no longer had the loop. She'd used it to get here, to this moment. And the loop was a function of the Keth system, and the Keth system was now disrupted. And she did not know if the reset would work without the coordination of a living node to power it. She might be through. She might have to do the rest of it the ordinary way, with only one life and only one try at each thing and no iterations to absorb the cost of failure. The thought was both terrifying and, in a way she would not have expected, a relief. "Tell the command team I'll be there in 10 minutes, she said. "I need to check on my people first." She walked back up the beach, through the surf and the debris, and the scattered detritus of a battle that had, for once, gone differently than every version of it that had come before. Bako fell in beside her. Rice was somewhere ahead, checking on the wounded from the station. The sun had come out, thin and pale, the kind of sun that February in the channel gave you, the kind that said, "This is what you get, make something of it." Dara Okafor made something of it. She walked up the beach she had died on 49 times, and she breathed the cold salt air, and she thought about what came next and what it would cost, and whether she had enough left in her to pay it. She decided, the way she always decided things, methodically, without sentiment, examining the evidence, that she did. That the signal, however faint, was still there beneath the noise. That she had been listening for it, long enough to trust herself to hear it. That the next time, she would find the thing at the center of all of it, and the time after that, and as many times as it took. She did not think of herself as a hero. She thought of herself as a signals analyst who had died 49 times and learned something each time and was still here, still upright, still moving toward the signal beneath the noise. That seemed like enough for now. That seemed like the specifically human thing. Not the dying, not even the coming back, but the part where you die 49 times and then you stand up on a beach and start planning the 50th without being asked. Nobody asked. Nobody ever needed to. She walked up the beach and she started planning.